So last week, we established that John Durham...
You better take it 1 second to tell us who Durham is.
Durham is the special counsel that I appointed to look into how this got going.
Figured out that the quote-unquote SVR intelligence on which he based his entire investigation, he would have figured out by July of 2021 that not just that those were fabrications,
Russian disinformation,
but that SVR, Russian spies, had a plan to frame Hillary Clinton, and that he had picked up that plan to frame Hillary Clinton.
That's for Durham to figure out.
And any sane person, anybody claiming to follow the law, anybody trying to do a sound investigation would have dropped it at that point and said, do you know what, we're all wrong.
When he could not give Donald Trump evidence of a deep state conspiracy, Mr. Durham gave him the next best thing, a public narrative with Hillary Clinton as the villain.
Not only did these claims about Hillary framing Donald Trump, not only were they wrong, they were in fact an effort by Russian spies to frame Hillary.
Over the ensuing years, Mr. Durham constructed a flimsy story built on shaky inferences and dog whistles to far-right conspiracy theorists.
So he didn't stop.
Although he lost both times, he took a case to trial. By prolonging his investigation, Durham was able to keep Donald Trump's talking points in the news long after Trump left office.
And I want to talk about what he did instead.
We charged Mr. Sussmann with having knowingly provided false information to the FBI regarding Alpha Bank.
Especially Michael Sussmann, who, remember, he was the DNC lawyer who brought the Alpha Bank anomalies to the FBI.
None of the individuals you prosecuted were ever charged with being part of a hoax or a fraud or a witch hunt or a politically motivated deep state conspiracy against Donald Trump. Isn't that correct?
I would not say that that's accurate.
You mean you did charge somebody with being a part of a hoax?
We charged Mr. Sussmann with having knowingly provided false information to the FBI regarding Alpha Bank.
But he was acquitted, though, right?
Well, that wasn't your question.
I want to talk about how he did that, because I think it's a very good roadmap for the show trials that Pam Bondi recently announced.
Attorney General Pam Bondi this week directed federal prosecutors to launch a grand jury investigation into accusations that members of the Obama administration manufactured intelligence about Russia's 2016 election interference.
The first thing that Durham did after he would have concluded that he had been chasing Russian disinformation for 2 years at that point, he had no evidence the FBI had these materials, which were the two prongs of his conspiracy theory, is he brought in a witness, Brian Auten, who was Igor Danchenko's handler for a while.
Igor Danchenko, he's a Russian-born analyst living in the United States, and he was interviewed back in 2017 by the FBI about his contributions to that Christopher Steele dossier. And what he told the FBI was that he provided raw intelligence to Christopher Steele about things that were essentially rumors, including that salacious allegation about a sex tape in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Moscow.
Auten was a Russian analyst. He has since either been fired or been put on leave. He is very much one of the targets of the far right.
Senator Chuck Grassley sent this letter to FBI Director Christopher Wray in July over concerns about Auten's handling of the investigation into Hunter Biden's alleged foreign business dealings.
Auten had been a sound witness for all of these investigations that went before, like the Senate Judiciary Committee, the House, the Inspector General, FBI's own investigation. Then all of a sudden he comes into Durham's office and Durham's like, you're a subject of this investigation.
As you may know, in the normal course, you have to advise people whether they're subjects or targets of investigations.
We're criminally investigating you. I suspect they did that based on the fact that he didn't clean up the Carter Page allegations before the FICE applications, but he wasn't involved in doing the FICE applications.
Department of Justice Inspector General Michael Horowitz pointed out Auten's failure to vet the Steele dossier and knowingly allowing false information to be used in warrant affidavits.
So it was, just an opportunity to say, we're going to investigate you. And then he said, did you see this referral? Durham is redacting the referral. Did you see this referral? And Auten, having been told he was under criminal investigation, said, maybe I carried it over from CIA to FBI. And based on that, he continued for 2 more years to get Sussmann to trial.
Mr. Sussmann was acquitted after you charged him, correct?
Grand jury found
he was found innocent by a unanimous jury of 12.
That's not true.
Well,
what's true is the grand jury found probable cause to indict Mr. Sussmann.
A jury of his peers acquitted him, though, correct?
And a trial jury.
You're not going to disagree on that, are you, Mr. Durham?
Remember, he had this grand conspiracy theory. So he wanted to charge this conspiracy that Hillary Clinton, on July 26th, decided to deal disinformation to the FBI. Having looked for over a year for that, he couldn't find it.
Mr. Durham flouted guidelines designed to protect third parties from reputational injury when he used his 2 indictments to accuse the Clinton campaign of a vast conspiracy to tie Trump to Russia.
So he charged Sussmann with a 1-count false statements charge. And this is important because this is what the maggots are saying, oh, we can charge John Brennan with now.
They knew it would promote this contrived narrative that Russia interfered in the 2016 election.
The they Gabbard references includes former CIA Director John Brennan.
But in his indictment,
this is a complicated case, but in fact, it boiled down to a single count of making false statements to the FBI in a meeting that the defendant, Michael Sussmann, had with then FBI General Counsel Jim Baker in September 2016, just a few weeks, 6 weeks or so before the election.
They're called speaking indictments, but he said, here are all the people, the big effort he had to fabricating these DNS records. All wrong, by the way, but he just made a very salacious indictment. Almost all journalists ran with it as the truth. Then, starting almost right away, he started telling Sussmann, oh, I didn't bother to collect evidence that was necessary to my charges. For example, he said that Sussmann had coordinated with the Hillary campaign. He had yet to interview any of the people that Sussmann allegedly coordinated with. Sussmann had testified under oath to the House and said, the reason I brought this tip to the FBI is because it was about to go public, and having used to work as a cybersecurity investigator, I know that can kind of suck, so I gave them a heads up. By the way, at trial, everyone from Hillary's campaign was like, fuck no, we wouldn't have given that to the FBI because they were busy screwing over Hillary Clinton. We wanted nothing to do with the FBI. But anyway, Sussmann had said that years earlier. Durham didn't even bother to test that theory.
What the special counsel team and John Durham were alleging is that Sussmann lied in order to get this meeting, that Sussmann told Baker he was not appearing.
In fact, it took him multiple tries to go back in FBI coffers to find out that, yeah, in fact, Sussmann had set up this meeting with the FBI and Eric Lichtblau at the New York Times and allowed the FBI to tell Eric Lichtblau not to publish yet. And in the process, tell them that he had a client that he had to consult, which threw out both their false claim charge and threw out his entire motive.
That was the heart of this case.
This is fucking insane. He never asked DOJ IG for the evidence that they used in the same investigation and only discovered in March of 2022, so 6 months after he charged, that there was a bunch of stuff that debunked his theory. And this is even crazier, he never asked Jim Baker, who was his single witness to the conversation between Sussmann and Jim Baker, he never asked him to go back and check his records. He never subpoenaed him. He never served a warrant on Apple. He didn't do the most basic things in collecting evidence. What he did instead is really alarming. So he discovers by July of 2021 that he's been chasing Russian disinformation.
I hope that John Durham, bless his heart for sticking with this, is not content to pursue only Michael Sussmann, a low-level Clinton operative.
And so what does he do? He starts partnering with Russians claiming to be aggrieved. In the Igor Danchenko trial, again, this is insane. In the Igor Danchenko trial, he charged it without ever having interviewed Sergei Milyan yet. He charged it based off Milyan's tweets. And I got to tell you, all journalists who covered this were like, we don't even know if that's Sergei Milyan. He's not in the country. There's no way to validate that.
And have there been other projects too?
Some of my colleagues, they were involved in some other projects, but overall, Trump has done significant business with Russians, and the level of business amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars that he received as a result of interaction with Russian businessmen.
Hundreds of millions of dollars from Russian businessmen.
Correct.
That's Milyan. Durham didn't care. He charged it based on tweets. He did end up interviewing Milyan, but as soon as, and I said this to Milyan, I'm like, Milyan, you're going to have to come to the States and testify under oath. And then Milyan started getting really buggy.
Are you involved in any way with Russian intelligence agencies?
Absolutely no.
You've heard that, right?
Of course.
What do you say?
So I'm not involved.
Not involved? Do you ever report back to them?
Absolutely no.
Do they ever ask you questions or?
No.
But you have friends inside the government, don't you?
Of course.
But when Durham said, you need to come to the States, Milyan just went nuts. He's like, what, are you going to black bag me to bring me to the States to testify against Igor Danchenko? Those were 4 charges that all were tied to Sergei Milyan that he did not ask him about yet. Even more troubling, Alpha Bank, if you remember the Mueller report, there's this part where he interviews Peter Avin, who is one of the guys behind Alpha Bank. And Avin said, we have these quarterly meetings with Putin, and at our quarterly meeting with Putin after Trump's election, he said, you need to start doing X, Y, and Z. One of those things is you need to make sure that Alpha Bank doesn't get sanctioned. And so starting right away in January 2017 and continuing until they were sanctioned in 2022, Alpha Bank engaged in one after another kind of lawfare to try and pressure the people who first found this anomaly. And in this period in 2022, they were claiming to want to sue the people who they claimed had fabricated the DNS anomalies. But in fact, what they wanted to do was get one after another DNS researcher to explain how the U.S. was using DNS to hunt Russian cybercrime. So in other words, they were seeking to compromise American law enforcement, and Durham piggybacked on that. So he was using that basically because the standards for interviews are different. So he was using that. For example, Rodney Joffy did a long deposition with them, and he used that to go after Joffy.
The thing that amazes me is that there's new characters sort of appearing that, most people that were doing this research, frankly, were not aware of at all. Like, for example, Joffy is someone that myself talking to a number of people who were deeply involved in these investigations, including, Kash Patel, which we talked about this on Kash's Corner, just simply wasn't aware of him being involved.
And this is, again, a lesson for what we're going to see on the show trials.
This character, he's got unbelievable levels of access to what's supposed to be an incredibly secure setting, right? Like ostensibly in the White House. So who is this guy?
Okay, some quick background. DNS is basically the addressing system for the internet. So think of it like the phone book. And Rodney Joffy is somebody who at the time had a big share of the, call it, phone book business. In other words, he was in the business of helping people find and track addresses on the internet. And with some researchers, they had been trying to use DNS records to track hackers. Because if hackers are looking up addresses, then they're trying to go to those addresses, I think is the short way of saying it. And after the June 14th, 2016 announcement by the DNC that they had been hacked, just as a test case for using DNS for hacking, a bunch of people very loosely associated said, let's see what we would find in DNS records and other public records. And that led them to finding the anomalies, the Spectrum Bank, Trump Tower, Alpha Bank anomalies, and also finding lookups for a bunch of Yoda phones, of Russian cell phones inside the United States, meaning somebody had a cell phone that doesn't work on U.S. phone infrastructure, and that's kind of odd. So they were like, this is a sign of that. And that's the background to this research that John Durham tried to criminalize.
Let's bring in independent journalist Marcy Wheeler.
This claim that Rodney Joffy was accessing data from the White House, all of that data precedes Trump's inauguration. So you've got Trump out there calling for these people to be put to death, when really what happened is Rodney Joffy was trying to keep Barack Obama safe from hackers. That's all it is. And that's why Trump wants these people killed. So, and Durham knows that. Durham knows that this data precedes Trump. He didn't include it in the filing. He wanted to charge Joffy with defrauding DOD. It was kind of a silly charge, but because there was a DARPA contract involved, he wanted to charge Joffy for defrauding DOD with regards to it. But he wanted to do that because there's an 8-year statute of limitations rather than 5. I mean, he literally charged Sussmann on the last day possible. And so he was like, looks around, he's like, who else can I find a statute of limitations that's still alive with? And he pursued Joffy for that reason. Again, this is something that the magats are talking about now. They're like, well, Brennan testified in 2020, so we could charge him in 2 weeks. Or so-and-so testified in 2022, so we could charge them for another 2 years.
Last week, Clapper and Brennan pushed back, writing, in making those allegations, they seek to rewrite history. We want to set the record straight, and in doing so, sound a warning.
So that's one of the things he's trying to do. Another thing he did, Durham was trying to harass, like Leonard Bernardo, the one whose emails were fabricated by SVR. And he went to Beryl Howell, who was the chief judge in D.C. at the time. Beryl Howell was like, you don't have any probable cause against this dude. No, you can't do that. So Durham, having been told no by a judge, nevertheless pressured Bernardo to give him the emails. The emails were one of the things that proved he was chasing
Russian disinformation.
But he did the same thing with Fusion GPS. Joffy, for a year before trial, and Fusion GPS for like 8 months before trial, were saying, look, if you want to get these emails, you're going to have to go to a judge. You're going to have to go to Beryl Howell. And they waited. And then right before trial, they're like, well, we want to breach privilege. We want to see what these documents say. That was actually interesting because another thing that they did all the time, or 3 times, is they would post things that were supposed to be sealed without sealing them, and they would create this frenzy among the frothers who would read them out of context and not understand that sometimes emails come up in UTC time zone. And he ended up getting a privileged review of some of the Fusion emails, but Judge Christopher Cooper told him he couldn't use it at trial. He did it anyway. He perjury trapped one of the Fusion GPS people at trial by showing her the metadata for an email that she hadn't been able to review and asking her questions out of context. But he did get, like, most of the emails he wanted to have reviewed were not for Sussmann's trial. They were for Igor Danchenko's trial, which were several months later. He never used those at trial. So it's a testament to the fact, I mean, one of the things that went on through this whole process, and again, it would go on if in this witch hunt that Pam Bondi is chasing, that you would have people with privilege, like, Barack Obama has privilege. You would have Fusion had a attorney-client relationship with the DNC. And most of these people were like, if I could just tell you the truth. Like Rodney Joffy wanted to testify in Sussmann's trial so that he could just explain what went on, but they wouldn't let him testify, A, because there was a privileged relationship, but more importantly, because they said they were still treating him as a subject of the investigation. And so as a result, Sussmann didn't have available the most important witness to help him for the case. Then Durham kind of fabricated information. One of the things that happened, again, in the same period when he discovers that he's chasing Russian disinformation, he also discovers that his suspicions about the DNS data were badly false. And so badly false that he couldn't use the expert that he had been working with for some time on this DNS. And the first thing he did instead, there were these 2 FBI guys, and they fucked up the investigation. They got the anomaly, they looked at it, and they said, there's nothing here, without really looking at the data and clearly misunderstanding the data. For example, and these, by the way, were guys who had seen the referral, what Durham calls the Clinton referral. They had seen the Russian disinformation, and they believed that Hillary Clinton was trying to frame Donald Trump. They may well be the source of John Durham's false belief that Hillary Clinton had to fabricate anything. And so they didn't investigate it. When Durham realizes he needs a new expert, he goes to one of those guys and says, can you be my expert? And the guy's like, dude, I barely know DNS. Durham did get somebody competent to be his DNS expert, but then asked him to review things in isolation. So in other words, by the time this happened, Joffy, Sussmann had given the FBI a ton of data and told them exactly where they got the data. When Durham asked the expert to review the data, he didn't show them all of the data that they had. And therefore they said, well, we don't know where this data comes from. And, once I looked at it, I was like, well, this is easy. Go to the other file and it tells you exactly where the data came from. And then the most stunning thing that Durham did was, I already explained that he got Brian Auten right at the beginning, right as he pivoted from discovering that he was chasing Russian disinformation. He said, you're under investigation. And he got Auten to change his opinion about Igor Danchenko over time as he was being told he was under criminal investigation. The other thing that happened, the key issue with Michael Sussmann was when you have a false statements case, it needs to be material. So you need to be able to argue, not only did you lie, but you lied in such a way that you prevented the government from doing something. And Durham's theory was, if the FBI had known that Michael Sussmann worked for the DNC, they would have looked at these anomalies much, much more closely. By the way, another thing he didn't get until after Sussmann demanded it was records of all of the communications that Sussmann had to respond to the DNC hack going back to June, right? And this was the absurdity of it. Sussmann said, it's ridiculous to assume the people investigating this wouldn't have assumed I was with the DNC. It's all through the contemporaneous notes that people did. In particular, that FBI agent I just told you about, who may be the source of the idea that Hillary fabricated that, it's in his notes. He said, did you do the DNC report? And in trial prep, Andrew DeFilippis, who was sort of the mastermind of these fabrications, he's going over it with the guy who received that text, and he says, oh, I think that must be a typo. It must mean DNS. So in other words, what John Durham was doing to sustain his conspiracy theory a year and a half after having discovered that it was Russian disinformation, was trying to go back and re-script contemporaneous notes. He did the same thing with one of the counterintelligence FBI agents who, again, his notes said, Sussmann, DNC lawyer, he turned him into a subject of the investigation. And after he became the subject of the investigation, his memory altered as well. You know, there's part of me that says these trials, both the Sussmann trial and the Igor Danchenko trial, delivered a whole bunch of transparency, especially the Sussmann one. It revealed how terrible the investigation of the DNS anomalies were, which pisses me off because at the time I lived in Grand Rapids, and it really roiled Grand Rapids, and we really could have used the FBI to investigate what the fuck it was rather than just blowing it off. But it's important to remember that both these men, both Danchenko and Sussmann, had incredibly good lawyers, had just absolutely spectacular lawyers. I'm sure bankrupted Igor Danchenko, and Sussmann, of course, couldn't work while he was pursuing these criminal charges. And the way these things beat people down, right? I called it the Hunger Games. One of the things Durham necessarily set up at trial, he forced Sussmann, who had been a friend of Jim Baker, he forced Sussmann to beat the shit out of Jim Baker's credibility because that was the way he was going to be acquitted. And you could just see Jim Baker, who Durham had already investigated him when this investigation started for a leak. So he had already been under investigation for 2 years at the time the Durham investigation started, and immediately said, I will cooperate with you.
Mr. Baker admitted that he is a friend of Michael Sussmann. He knew he worked for the DNC. He knew he also happened to be Hillary Clinton's campaign general counsel.
Yeah, all I could think of when I was reading the transcript was that Jim Baker was suffering from Stockholm syndrome, and he was willing to give whatever answers John Durham wanted out of him.
Is there anything you would have done differently?
I would have run screaming from the building.
Meaning you wouldn't have done you'd have gotten out of the FBI.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, after this, all of this. And I say that jokingly, but this whole thing was traumatic. And just as I was listening to as you went through the various things that I worked on, this was horrible. This whole thing was terrible.
Every time Durham found a new piece of evidence that he hadn't checked before he started, which would have made it clear he had no case, it was just, quite honestly, terrible, tragic to read the transcript of this happening, because here you had two friends and one had to beat the shit out of the credibility of the other. And possibly, I think if there hadn't been an acquittal, or if other things had happened, if, for example, Durham were under Trump now and could continue indefinitely, I think he might have charged Jim Baker.
There may be those instances in which you're pretty well convinced that a crime was committed and can identify the person who committed it, but you can't in good faith say a jury is likely to convict in this case. We believe that a jury will convict and we can sustain it on appeal.
I think he might have charged the Fusion person who was perjury trapped.
Those are the principles that we tried to apply here.
And this is where these show trials are going to go, and they end up rewriting history. One of the things that Durham made clear of and actually confessed to in his testimony to Congress is that absolutely no clue what actually happened. In the Igor Danchenko trial, he was looking at the communications between Sergei Milian and George Papadopoulos, and he was like, yeah, I admit these look creepy. He had never looked. He hadn't looked to test Milian's credibility, what he was doing in the same period as SVR was sowing this conspiracy theory with Hillary Clinton with George Papadopoulos. And so what he was trying to do, and there was this mad battle right before both trials, especially the Sussmann one, he was like, you can't talk about how Donald Trump said,
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
That's extraneous. That's mean to Donald Trump.
We didn't investigate that.
And Sussmann was like, this is about my mindset. This is about the mindset of the researchers who said, let's go find out whether people close to Trump have illicit bank accounts in Cyprus, which Paul Manafort did. Let's go figure out whether the son-in-law of Alpha Bank has ties to Trump, which one did. What he did was start with his propagandistic, start with the false claims about what happened, the Russia claims rather than the reality. And based off that, he tried to build this fiction through this legal case, and he didn't give a damn how he cheated to do it. He didn't give a damn how many times he ignored a judge's order to do it, which was 6, by the way. He didn't give a damn that he was basically himself being so dishonest with the evidence that it amounts to deceit. And again, this is where they want to go again.
Russian disinformation